Hi folks, my name is Brian Starzom2020V2. I'm the Director of the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria and the Ian McTaggart-Cowan Professor of Biodiversity Conservation and Ecological Restoration. I'm putting together here a general lecture on biodiversity patterns around the world, what gives rise to biodiversity, and some information about patterns of biodiversity in British Columbia. So we'll jump right in with a definition of what biodiversity is. And it really is this big, broad term that in a sense is not very scientific. It replaces a number of very specific terms like species richness, which is the total number of species, and relative abundances, and combines them all together in a catch-all term that's really become something that is a term that a lot of people know. It's quite catchy. It's the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So you can think of it as all life on Earth, but typically we use it to mean the total number of species that we're looking at in a place. In general, when we think of the diversity of life on Earth, there's these four different components of biodiversity. Genetic diversity, that's the genetic variation within populations or species, the reason that we differ from other species like a chimpanzee or a bonobo or something like that by only a small amount, but still can give rise to differences between species. So the species diversity, the number of species in an area, and the relative abundances. The diversity amongst higher taxa, like variation between genera, families, orders, classes, etc., that you probably know of from the Linnaean classification system. And then something else that we'll talk about quite a bit from BC, which is ecosystem diversity, the variation among ecosystems, communities, and landscapes that we see out in nature. Scientists typically distinguish three important different types of biodiversity, and it's really important to understand these three different types. Unfortunately, they're given these relatively unhelpful names, alpha, beta, and gamma diversity, but I'll go into these a little bit deeper to hopefully help you understand a bit more about why it's important to look at biodiversity in these three different ways. We'll start with alpha diversity, and you can see on the slide here, there's an image of the Earth. We're going to choose an area, what we're going to refer as as our local place, our one place. So alpha diversity is the total number of species that you find in one place, one local place that you define. So in this example, we might say all of the species in California. But it could be that it could be all of the species in British Columbia. It could be all the species within the ring of UVic, or it could be all the species in Cunningham Woods at UVic. You get to define what that local place is. We'll skip beta diversity for a second because it's the most complicated and probably the most important of the different ones, and go to gamma diversity, which goes from that local diversity up to regional diversity. So gamma diversity is the species that we find in an entire region. So in this case, it might be all of the species on the globe, or all of the species on planet Earth. Beta diversity is really what gives rise to huge amounts of biodiversity around the globe. It's the difference in species in different places. So for example, in our example here, we might say the difference in our species list in California and then the species in the Central Amazon. So we know, for example, that the species in California are very, very different than the species in the Central Amazon. There's no parrots or antbirds native to California as an example, and yet there are many species of each of those groups in the Central Amazon. So beta diversity is really the difference in species, or the turnover in species. It's a very important concept to recognize. So why should we care about these patterns, or these different terms for different patterns of biodiversity? Well, it turns out that when we look at different places on the globe, we see differences in the species that are there. Interestingly, despite being in what we think of as one of the great biodiversity extinction events potentially in the history of the globe, on average around the globe, there's no consistent decrease in local diversity, or what we just referred to as alpha diversity. So there's been a number of different research papers on this, and this topic, of course, is quite controversial because we think that in general around the globe there are these real declines in biodiversity. If we look at this one of the first papers in this series, led by Mark Velland at the University of Sherbrooke in Quebec, we see data from all over the planet, and then, importantly, if you look at the figure down in the bottom right of your screen here, you see that the effect size of changes in species diversity or species richness at a place center around 0. That means that on average, the number of species that are in places in 2 points in time is about the same. This doesn't say anything about the identity of those species. It just says something about the total number of them. And we see this all across different places in the world. So we can look at different habitats on different continents and with different drivers of diversity changes. So interestingly, even with all of the things that are happening on the planet, with invasions, local extinctions, oil spills, urbanization, habitat loss, etc., there is no consistent decrease in local alpha diversity. So the total number of species is staying the same in places, even though the identity of those species is changing. We're losing gamma diversity, or the diversity of the entire globe. So at the moment, our so-called global biodiversity crisis that we're in, where we're losing species across the planet, it's not right now primarily about decline in the number of species, but rather about large-scale reorganization. So when we're losing species, when species are going extinct, they're being replaced locally by invasive species. So we're doing something called biotic homogenization. The same species are ending up being successful and found all around the world. And here are 3 examples of ones that are local to Vancouver Island that have arrived relatively recently: Pacific oyster, Eurasian collar dove, and Armenian or Himalayan blackberry. For a couple of these, anyhow, you get an idea of where they came from, but now they're found both in those original places across Eurasia and as well in the new areas around Vancouver Island. And of course, this is all happening with major declines in biodiversity around the world and major changes to habitats. So there are many stories about this as research comes out that shows the effect of habitat loss, habitat change, climate change, and biodiversity loss having major impacts on human society. So here's an example of a story: human society under urgent threat from loss of Earth's natural life, from a recent report where scientists suggested that as many as 1 million species might be extinct, at risk of extinction. And this is happening at an unprecedented pace. Other than the 5 main mass extinctions that have occurred in the past due to things like extraterrestrial bodies slamming into the Earth, this is a human-caused change to the environment with very rapid happening changes and species losses across a variety of different taxa. We've got really great data that shows that there are major declines in the numbers of individuals of birds, and there have been extinctions as well of birds. Here are 3 of the species that went extinct in North America over the last 500 years from left to right: the ivory-billed woodpecker, the Carolina parakeet, and passenger pigeon. Interestingly, passenger pigeon at one point was probably the most common bird in the world, the most abundant species of bird in the world. And the last one was lost in the Cincinnati Zoo in about 1914. We can look around the world and we can ask the question, how much biodiversity is there? Usually I ask for people in the classes that I'm lecturing to give me an estimate of what they think. And what's interesting about this is we don't actually know. Our guesses right now for the total number of species on the planet are just that. They're estimates based on what species we've found to date. I've seen credible estimates into the billions, but many people usually put a cap at about 100 million species potentially on the planet. But a very realistic recent estimate is about 8.7 million plus or minus minus 1.3 million species around the world. And like I said, these are estimates. Most species haven't been described yet. There's maybe 2 million described species. A number of those are probably duplicates, actually. About 800,000 of those are insects, and half of those insects are beetles. And we can look at figures like this. This is an interesting figure. It's a pie chart, which I don't normally think is a fantastic way to get information across, but this one does a reasonably good job of dividing up most of life on Earth into a pie like this. And each of the pie chunks represents what proportion of that group of species make up the whole. So for example, we can look at the blue here, and you can see on the right in the legend it shows that blue refers to insects. And if we look at that big pie piece in the exploded pie, we can see two different colors of blue. There's one lighter shade of blue closer to the center and one darker shade of blue out on the edge. The lighter shade of blue refers to the proportion of that group of species that's been described. And the darker shade of blue refers to the proportion yet to be discovered. So for example, in the case of insects, we can see that maybe as many as a third of them have been described. Interestingly, most of the species that we tend to care about most are chordates, right? To a first approximation, animals with backbones, and you can see right at the top there, the chordates are this kind of yellowish color, and if you look to the left in the pie chart, you can see that the chordates make up what looks like a little chopstick with an eraser at the top, showing that about 99% of all of the chordates, or animals with backbones on the planet, have been described. So almost all of the mammals, all of the birds, there are about 10,000 species of birds. We discover a new bird species maybe once every couple of years, same with mammals. Almost all of the species, the grizzly bears, the fish, the snakes, etc., that we know and we love, we actually know pretty well. Most of the biodiversity on the planet is in those smaller things: insects, crustaceans, fungi, algae, etc. We can go out though and we can find really interesting species. We can find a new species right on the UVic campus or on Vancouver Island without too much trouble, but it's not going to be a mammal, it's not going to be a bird, it's going to be some small thing. Here's a series of examples of really interesting insect species taken by a local photographer, Thomas Barbin, within about 10 kilometers of downtown Victoria. And you can see the huge diversity in beetles, for example, very, very close to the city. Over the last several centuries, millennia, humans have made up only about 0.01% of all life, but we've managed to destroy about 83% of all wild mammals, according to one study. And we can look at the total biomass of the human race relative to the biomass of all of the other species on the planet. All of life on Earth is made up of about 82% plants, about 13% bacteria, 5% everything else, including all animals and so on. Humans make up a very small amount of the Earth's total biomass. Most of the biomass is found on land, about 1% in the oceans and 13% in deep subsurface bacteria. Biomass stays on land for a long period of time and continually turns over in the oceans, which might help you to understand why so much of it is on land. Here's a really great figure drawn by the cartoonist xkcd.com, and it just takes some of the data from studies that show Earth's land mammals by weight. So the key thing to look at here is that there are three different categories: humans in dark gray, our pets and livestock in light gray, and then crucially in green, wild animals. And you can see in the center, each one of these boxes, by the way, is 1 million tons. In the center, you can see the biomass of humans and then the biomass of land mammals. It's kind of shocking. Most of it is in things like our livestock, cattle, pigs, goats, and very, very little of land mammal biomass is in wild animals in green. You can see elephants tucked down at the bottom. So another way of looking at this, about 60% All the mammals on Earth are livestock. A little more than a third are humans, and 4% are wild mammals. Most of the birds are chickens and other poultry, 70%, and about 30% of biomass is wild. So since the rise of human civilization, 83% of wild mammals have been lost. As many as 80% of marine mammals, 50% of plants, and 15% of fish. It's a significant change due to human activities. So we might ask where in the world the most biodiversity is. Most of it, as you probably know, is in the tropics. Now here's an interesting map that shows the species number per ecoregion. So the species number per ecoregion is just showing the number of plants in each of the ecoregions around the world. And what you can do is you can look for the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, sticking out there in the Eastern Pacific. They're right on the equator, so you can draw a line of the equator and you get an idea of where the tropics are. And you can see that most species are clustered around the tropics. It's what we refer to as the latitudinal decline in the number of species, and that holds across most biodiversity. There are fewer and fewer species as you get farther and farther from the equator. There's some global hotspots where there are lots of biodiversity, but also lots of threats, and you can see that there are very few of them in the northern hemisphere. Most and southern hemisphere, most are clustered around the equator. These are places where there are a lot of people, a lot of development, and so on, but also a lot of species. Canada is a northern country, being part of that latitudinal gradient in biodiversity loss, or decline rather, towards the poles, has less than you might expect given its size. It's the second biggest country in the world, but out of those 8.7 million plus or minus 1.3 million species that we might think of on the planet, Canada has maybe 80,000 to 140,000 species, depending on what estimate you look to or how you count. If we look at the country of Canada, we look at the 13 jurisdictions, the 3 territories, and the 10 provinces. BC far and away has the most. We have probably half of all of the species in Canada in this province. It's remarkable. And so we can look at, for example, these really nice maps of the biogeoclimatic zones of British Columbia. This one shows 14 biogeoclimatic zones from alpine tundra, high on the tops of the tallest mountains and the northernmost mountains in BC, all the way to the coastal western hemlock, that coastal forest that you probably know well, dominated by big trees and loads of rain. And if we look more deeply into this, we can see that BC has over 1,100. It's pretty awesome. BC is a remarkable place that has incredible and unique biodiversity. So why does British Columbia have such unique biodiversity? And here's a slide with a number of different shots that I've taken, or in the case of the spider down on the bottom right, Thomas Barbin took as part of a BC Parks iNaturalist project that I'll talk about a little bit later, all around the province, from rattlesnakes and scorpions in the extreme south in places like South Okanagan grasslands area near Soyuz to some of our urban biodiversity, things like Cooper's hawks and the many wolves that we've got, and things that exist in the north in habitats that extend all the way across the country to places like Labrador and moose. BC has such high and unique biodiversity because of a handful of things, probably 6 really big drivers. The first is this huge diversity of landscapes that our province has. Next, we have a high diversity of climates, of temperature and precipitation, from near desert to the rainiest place in North America outside of Hawaii. A real diversity of elevations, a diversity of geology, different bedrock types that can drive differences over very small areas in biodiversity. A real diversity of glacial histories, and really what that means is that it divided up parts of the province and forced animals animals to choose to be on one side or the other of ice sheets that might have isolated them for a time. And what's also the final thing is peripheral habitats. So in BC, we have this huge diversity of landscapes. It's really remarkable, from high mountains to dry grasslands, dry near desert areas in the South Okanagan, very, very wet areas like this photo of the Quay River on the central coast of BC in the so-called Great Bear Rainforest. It's very, very wet. We also have big rivers of a whole bunch of different types. So this huge diversity of landscapes leads to a diversity of habitats for many different species. Because of our mountainous area, we also have a diversity of climates. We've got very, very cold areas, of course, on the tops of mountains or in parts of interior northern BC. We also have very, very dry areas as a consequence of rain shadow effects that may happen where water-bearing storms and clouds and so on push up against mountains, dump their water on one side of the mountains, and have none left to put on the other side of the mountain. So we get things like near desert in the South Okanagan that can lead to things like this prickly pear. But we also have very small microclimate and micro topography or topography effects on small scales that can lead to very, very dry areas where you might not expect it, like in some parts of the coast. The coastal Douglas fir that we'll talk about in a little while is quite a dry area. But we also have very, very wet areas, including places on Vancouver Island that are the wettest places in North America. So we get wet-adapted species like this pink fawn lily, for example. These diversities of climates lead to all kinds of different habitat types for many, many different types of species. We have a diversity of elevations. Here's another shot from the Central Coast or Great Bear Rainforest. This is Roscoe Inlet in Heiltsuk Territory on the central coast of BC, going from sea level up to over 1,000 meters in a very, very short period, or a very, very short distance. And mountains in BC go over 4,000 meters, so all the way from sea level to 4,000 meters. We have a huge diversity of geology that leads to differences in landforms, of course, but also in the sorts of bedrocks. And so there are species that prefer acidic bedrocks versus basic bedrock, and that can lead to a number of different patterns of biodiversity on the planet or in BC. And you can see, looking at this, if you kind of squint your eyes and look at this map, which I'd encourage you to go and have a look at in detail, as it's a fascinating map, you can see a general trend of northwest to southeast lines in this map. And it shows the way that BC effectively was built over millions of years with these so-called accreting terrains, islands, kind of like the Queen or the Haida Gwaii and Vancouver Island, smashing into the side of the continent of North America, creating mountain uplift and so on, and accreting these different bits of terrain onto BC. BC also has quite a diversity of glacial histories. Of course, we still have lots of glacial ice, including the most heavily glaciated mountains at their latitude in the world, in the coast mountains. But this diversity of glacial histories has also divided up areas in BC in ways that have isolated populations of animals that might have bred together or were found together prior to the glaciation. There's really great examples of this in a number of different kind of sister species of birds, for example, that we've got. Here's an example of the red-breasted sapsucker and the red-naped sapsucker, two sapsucker woodpecker species that are common in BC. One dominates on the coast, separated during the last glaciation from the other, red-naped sapsucker, which dominates more in the interior. These are the sorts of patterns that were driven by, at least partially, by differences in glacial histories and also isolating effects of those glaciers on populations of these species in the past. You can see their you can see their ranges. Red-breasted sapsucker is much more coastal than red-naped sapsucker, and these ranges are partly the consequence of being driven apart by glacial activity in the past. We also, as a northern country, host the leading edge peripheral range or habitat for a number of different species in North America. Here's an example of a very rare at-risk dragonfly in Canada and in British Columbia called the grappletail, Octagonphus specularis, that's found only in a small number of streams in the lower mainland at the base of the coast mountains in the lower mainland. And you can see that its range extends all the way down almost to northern Baja California and just barely gets into Canada. We have a number of peripheral habitats that just barely get into Canada but are more extensive in the United States, in places like along the Kootenay River in eastern BC, in the South Okanagan, and of course in the lower mainland and southern Vancouver Island. You might think that this means that those species are doing better in the core of their range in the United States, although it's often not the case, and that the peripheral habitats at the north end of the range are in the best shape of any of those habitats, and thus those species, A, hang on longer in those peripheral habitats, and B, they're poised to move as climate changes and they're forced to move north. So these peripheral habitats are actually very, very important, and they're often a target of ecological restoration in British Columbia and other places where they occur, like Ontario. BC is also very important as the last area in North America where, for example, if you look at this map, you can see that North American carnivores and ungulates still co-occur. So when we look at the historic component of this map, we're looking at North America, say 200 years ago or longer, where interacting species of carnivores and their prey, and we're talking about cougars and elk, wolves and moose, and so on, they had much more extensive ranges in the past. Now it looks like, with all of the changes to North American habitats over the last several centuries, that somebody took a vacuum cleaner and sucked up all of those species from southern North America and eastern North America into British Columbia. BC is the core of the range for many of these very important and very popular species for people across North America. But we're doing a great job of splitting BC up into all kinds of different small pieces and changing the habitats. You can see this is work by Nancy Shackelford from the Restoration of Natural Systems program, who looked at the biogeoclimatic zones in BC and laid over top of them changes that have happened to those habitats. Things like logging, oil and gas development, infrastructure development, urbanization, and so on. And so that's what the black is in this image. Those are areas where habitat has been drastically altered. And you can add all of these things up, as she did in her paper, and you can look at the different sorts of impacts, these indirect effects, the logging, the age of the replanted areas, if the stand ages are quite young, the oil and gas development, roads, and agriculture. And you can add them all up, and you can see that some of our biogeoclimatic zones are intensively changed, especially the ones that we really like to live in: the interior Douglas fir, the ponderosa pine, the bunch grass of the Okanagan Valley, and then the coastal Douglas fir of coastal BC, where so many of BC's residents like to live. These biogeoclimatic zones are very, very high in biodiversity, but fundamentally changed in terms of impacts of humans. And so we've gone from areas, these are the sorts of things that we do in BC, to these habitats because the natural resources are worth a whole heck of a lot of money. Many of you may have seen this tree yourself. This is Big Lonely Doug, a truly enormous tree. In this image you can see a woman in a red jacket standing at the bottom of the tree. but most of this sort of habitat in British Columbia has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So let's look a little bit closer at one of the biogeoclimatic zones. In particular, we'll look at the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone, which is that biogeoclimatic zone that's found on southeastern Vancouver Island and a little bit on the mainland, around the lower mainland. This is generally what a really good example of this biogeoclimatic zone might look like. This is Mount Finlayson in Goldstream Provincial Park near Victoria, BC. And here are some of the characteristics of this coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone. You can see in the background there's lots of green. These are rolling hills and Douglas fir forest, in this case partly from Goldstream Provincial Park, but also the Greater Victoria watershed. There are many dry adapted species because this is an area that's in the rain shadow of the Olympic Mountains, as well as the Souk Hills of western Vancouver Island. And so surprisingly, the amount of rainfall that happens in this part of Vancouver Island can be much less than a quarter of the rainfall found in other parts of Vancouver Island. And that leads to many dry adapted species, many range restricted species that are only found in this area. You get these dry grassy balds that are filled with interesting species. It's the area of BC where we find Garry oaks and associated Garry oak ecosystems filled with their things like camas species that were historically tended and harvested by local First Peoples in a very sophisticated tending landscape. With all of the people that also live in this area, there's also a huge number of invasive species that have come into this environment, like the Scotch broom that you can see around the Garry oak, and of course the many, many invasive species of grasses that have come in with agriculture, etc. So in general, this is what the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone looks like. It's the area in the darkest green here. This is a map that shows an area that is the coastal Douglas fir and associated ecosystems conservation partnership boundary. So it extends it out to bits of the coastal western hemlock biogeoclimatic zone, of which there are small little components within the coastal Douglas fir. You can see a couple of them on tops of the mountains on Salt Spring Island. This is an area with the highest human population density in BC, a huge amount of infrastructure, a long, long history of resource exploitation in terms of logging and fishing and so on. But many of the components of this landscape are the direct result of real intensive management by First Nations that has largely been extinguished. So management by actual on-the-ground manipulation of landscapes, including the use of fire, lead to things that would have looked like this in the past. And this is a photo of a deep soil Garry oak site. You can see the emerging Garry oak in the background with a great big Garry oak ecosystem savanna in the foreground, composed mostly in this case with the purple of camas that was historically harvested. And we can look back, we can see to, for example, the Victoria region in 1842. This is a map that was drawn by Adolphus Lee Lewis. The dark green in this map is generally Douglas fir forest and other forests. The light green is Garry oak savanna, and the red dot is Fort Victoria. So you can get a sense of downtown Victoria, which is around that red dot today. And you can see some other features here, like some wetlands in sort of a greenish brown. This area really, or this map, really shows the extent of these Garry oak savannas in the past. These things that would have looked something like this. This is at Beacon Hill Park in the spring of 2020. You can see emergent chocolate lilies, a couple of different species of camas, lots of invasive grass species, and some daffodils and so on. But historically, a huge area. You could walk effectively all the way from downtown Victoria to Oak Bay, perhaps all the way from downtown Victoria to Schwartz Bay to the ferry terminal through a savanna like this that was heavily managed by people for the production of food. In this case, dominantly the camas bulbs that these camas plants produce. Now, much of this area has been urbanized. The urban habitat quality is often low, but what remains is really productive and important for many species. It's heavily biased in that there are very, very few predators, almost none. So there can be very hyperabundant prey, like these Columbian black-tailed deer. And this can have real negative impacts on native vegetation, along with the very small amount of habitats that exist. And it's worth having a read through this article on BC's extinction crisis here on the right, where you get a sense of the sorts of changes that have occurred over time and that have accelerated, especially over the last 30 years or so in British Columbia. So the things like the Victoria's owl clover now, which is found in coastal Douglas fir areas, especially in rocky bluffs along the coast, has its entire habitat extent or range extent on the planet reduced to the size of a small building, right? So there's very, very little habitat left for these sorts of things. I'd like to pivot just a little bit here and talk about ways that you can contribute to better understanding of biodiversity in these situations. You can contribute your own observations so that we can learn more about biodiversity in BC by using the iNaturalist app or the iNaturalist website, inaturalist.org or inaturalist.ca. It turns out that we have very good information on BC biodiversity, but it's changing all the time, and we need more information on biodiversity. iNaturalist can help with this. Here's an example of an iNaturalist project that you can make. In this case, this is a project that I run in partnership with Simon Fraser University, BC Parks, and the BC Parks Foundation, where we're doing iNaturalist surveys across British Columbia in all of the protected areas, the provincial protected areas. There's 1,033 of them. So this project includes all 1,033 of those conservancies, protected areas, provincial parks, and ecological reserves. And we've managed to get almost 200,000 observations of over 6,000 species. This app is really fantastic because anybody can use it. It's a free app that's used worldwide. You can share your photo observations of plants, animals, and fungi, especially wild ones. It can help you with species identification because it has a very powerful built-in artificial intelligence that will actually identify the species for you from the photo that you take. And you can look and see what other people have found. And other people will look at your observations, and for those observations to become so-called research grade, they're confirmed by another observer who says, yes, I know that species, it's a harbor seal, and I can confirm that it is. So you get that second confirmation of your species. And it's great. You can use it to learn more about different places. You can summarize information by geographic region, in this case by Vancouver Island, for example, and you can see what people have seen recently. You can do it by map as well and restrict it to, for example, amphibian species, so you can see where there are northern Pacific tree frogs or rough-skinned newts, and you can contribute your own observations. You can create your own projects. This is an example from one of the parks, Cypress Provincial Park, and you get the boundaries of that area. You can input those into iNaturalist. It will automatically include every single observation within those boundaries, and you get a nice idea of what is present. You might do this with one of your restoration projects, for example, but you can get a sense of what's there, how many species, what those species are, and it produces nice visuals like you can see right here with the species that are found. So you can use iNat in a whole bunch of different ways. You can use the app in the field. I tend not to. I use my phone a lot to take photos, but I don't use the app. I just take the photos and then I upload them later by the website because you can do a lot at once. But if you're using your phone out in the field, it's great in the field because you can get an ID if you've got Wi-Fi or your cell data. You just Turn on your location services, it will geotag your photo. So you can upload small numbers of photos as observations and impress your friends with the parlor trick where you take a picture of a plant and it tells you exactly what that species is. So it looks something like this. You can take the photo, you can add it, and it becomes an observation directly from your phone. You can download those photos from your phone or your camera later to your computer though, and then you can upload them 100 at a time to the website, which allows you to process large numbers of observations pretty quickly in a very, very easy way that also uses iNaturalist's computer vision to suggest an ID, but then also follows up, for example, with the community, which can go in and give you some more information on those sorts of species and help to confirm your identification. And this is great. It's a huge boon to understanding biodiversity, not just in BC, but around the world. We can document range expansions. We see when new invasive species arrive or are spreading in an area. We can monitor diseases. We can help to detect and track threatened and endangered species. And you can make your own species inventories for your own projects. So as an example, it's been used to track starfish wasting and recovering on the Pacific coast of BC and North America, which has been a big issue. You can use it to find new locations for threatened and endangered species, which is really interesting. And you don't, of course, have to have the ID exact at the beginning. It can come from, as in this case, from the community. And the province is using this in a whole bunch of different ways. Like I said, BC Parks is using it to document and celebrate biodiversity in their parks. But it's also being used, for example, by the provincial invasive species tracking group to discover more about invasive species in the province. I just want to finish with one last set of points here. Talk about what the big 5 threats are to biodiversity and what causes biodiversity declines. And there really are 5 main threats. The first is land use change, effectively habitat loss and fragmentation. When we turn an old-growth forest on Vancouver Island into a mall parking lot or into agriculture or urbanization, these are the sorts of things that we do to live in a place. But that habitat loss or land use change leads to huge declines in biodiversity. Next is climate change. As the climate changes, it turns out that this is changing not only where species are found, species are having to move to track their climate optima, but it also destroys habitats and is causing declines in habitats or declines in species. Introduced species, especially the worst of them, the invasive species, also can cause real changes to quality of habitat or plain old outcompete native species. And then the next is overexploitation. So we talked about passenger pigeon before. At one point was the most abundant bird and probably in the world, and we shot most of them and destroyed their habitat. We shot them to eat them, along with things like Atlantic cod that you can see here in the lower left, and the Eskimo curlew, which was once a very, very abundant shorebird that's now extinct. And the final one is pollution through, for example, nitrogen deposition. The nitrogen gets into the water. You see, for example, these giant algae blooms, and this is not in and of itself a bad thing because it's causing growth. But what happens is, as those things like the algae die and they rot in the water column, they use up all of the oxygen and cause asphyxiation for the species that are there. And then the really big issue, is pointed out by, for example, Nancy Shackelford's paper, is this idea of cumulative effects. You add up land use change plus climate change plus nitrogen deposition plus overexploitation plus invasive species, and you get into really big biodiversity trouble. It's the combination of these things that we're not very good at dealing with. We can deal with habitat loss. We can deal with invasive species. We can go out and pull Scotch broom, for example. But when all 5 of these things are happening at once, we have real problems dealing with them. So all of these things are present in huge amounts in the coastal Douglas fir. It's one of the most densely populated, most used parts of British Columbia. So this represents a huge opportunity for ecological restoration, for saving biodiversity in British Columbia. And the coastal Douglas fir is amongst the most biodiverse and threatened parts of BC. There are parts of the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone that probably have the highest densities of species at risk anywhere in Canada. So restoring even small bits of habitat can have huge impacts on local and regional biodiversity. And we see this in great examples around the coastal Douglas fir, places like the Trial Islands or the Harling Point Chinese Cemetery area, Mount Doug, Peak-Holes, Mount Ptolemy, Fort Rodd Hill National Historic Site, Beacon Hill Park, and a number of others. So restoration activities in these areas can make a huge difference. Thank you very much.